So I think and I was going back and forth whether I should do this or not, but I think two teams that need to be pulled from the 2019 Iditarod for rule violations are Blair Braverman. Doesn't matter if her fan base or fake fan base in the lower 48 raised a bunch of money for schools. The reason the outside assistance rule is being violated is because her husband or fiance is snow machining the trail and up there with her team. The other issue with the other team is the exact same issue, Christy Barrington, and I believe she it's more explicitly obvious online where through the KLKC live thing there's photos of him kneeling down on the straw with the dogs with his wife and uh, embracing his wife at multiple different locations and checkpoints out there. On one part of me says, well, this is silly, they're back of the pack, they're not competitive, but I think it's sending a message that this sort of stuff is okay where it really isn't. And you know I also think there's problems with the race officiating if they're sending Kale Casey and Andy Pohl back to pick up teams that scratched or something like that, because all of a sudden you're enlisting a competitor's spouse to do work for the race, and the problems with that is moving forward you're less likely if these guys are working for the race like Andy Pohl is, in any sort of official or unofficial capacity, they're less likely to be held to those same standards in terms of rule violations and the rule violations of outside assistance, which is what Andy Pohl's doing. So basically, these guys are sort of disrespected and making a laughing stock of the rules in the race, and you know. It's a honeymoon for these guys or something up there, and because Quincy Mount, they get a bunch of Twitter fan base, right? So they can do what they want and they can get away from the rules of the race. And I think it's problematic. You've got Nordman in there. Obviously, Nordman needs to go. But more importantly, I think it's problematic that there is these, uh, there's these issues very deep ingrained in the mushing community and with the actual race organization of corruption. And that's my take on it. I think the other issue is Emily Maxwell jumping on the runners the last minute for this team from Montana, not the dog she's been working with. Obviously, that's like someone going to play the Super Bowl with a team that she hasn't been, practicing with. And, we're just fortunate there's not a dead dog there. If there was a dead dog there, would we even know about it, with the status of officiating, etc. So that's an issue as well. I think that, the race officials should not have let that team go out on the trail. Uh, and they should obviously know whether if someone's running a team, maybe there's not a rule, maybe there needs to be a rule on that. If you're not running the team the year prior, you can't just jump on some dogs that don't belong to you, and you have no experience with, a few weeks before the race and go run the race just because you signed up and we're going to run it with someone else's team and you had a falling out or something like that. So that sort of summarizes some of the issues that I think are coming to a head with this particular 2019 Iditarod. I want to congratulate Pete Kaiser and Jor and the other teams that did well in the race, and I think that they had a conservative strategy and it paid dividends. I think Nick Petit and Jesse Holmes, and there's another group in there who raced pretty aggressively hard to do well in the mid-distance races leading up in the preliminary mid-distance races, for instance, like the Cusco, etc. And they, won several of them. And, there's not as much money in Iditarod this year, so I don't think that's necessarily a bad big-term plan. But, Kaiser, who's dominated the Cusco for years, he didn't win this year, but he came and won Iditarod. And so maybe that, he had the dogs peaking at the right time. And that is, it's great for southwestern Alaska, and it's great for the native villages to have Kaiser win. And, he looked great out there, looked healthy, it looked like he should win the race. I don't see any indication that, there's any reason why he should not have won the race. It's an honest win. And, I think, some of the other mushers, though, going out hard at the start of the race, like Jesse Holmes, who's a guy, he went out hard at the first checkpoint and stopped there. There's some strategy issues here. That's not necessarily the best place to take a big rest. Maybe you shouldn't be running so fast that first leg of the race. You're going into a checkpoint right at the beginning of the race. are you going to get your rest? There's a lot of other teams around. You maybe need to be camping outside the checkpoints, taking it easier at the start of the race. Some of the teams who did that, like Kaiser and like Jor, performed over the 1,000 miles better. So just some grains of insight there, but also in how you can look at that and say observation and say look at the entire race season. These guys maybe weren't racing the mid distance races as hard. Maybe they were. I don't know. But Petit kind of fell apart, and some of these other teams didn't do as well as they had hoped. But it's a crapshoot. It changes every year. But yeah, that's 2019 Iditarod in my mind. Real quick, those were the standout issues. Issues with the outside assistance, issues with Emily Maxwell running a team she had no familiarity with, and then obviously the big circle underlining that it's nice to see Kaiser win the race. But still there's this dark cloud. We've got Annie Baker not, we've got Ray Reddington, we've got John Baker not even in the race, not racing. Dallas is not in the race, not racing. Why are these guys not in the race, not racing? There's issues and corruption with this community and with this industry that aren't being addressed properly. That sport and that race should have a better explanation for the Dallas CV drug test thing. And, you know, they shouldn't have Stu Nelson still being the head vet if he's just going to say, well, someone administered this in terms of the drugs, and that's the end of the Dallas CV story. Well, we want to know who administered it, and we want to know why Iditarod Trail Committee has this redacted other test, positive test that they're not telling us about, but then they're crucifying Dallas in the news. So that's not really the end of Iditarod's story. That should be probably the end of uh, Stu Nelson, and there probably should be a criminal investigation against Iditarod. So these other issues, obviously, with Emily Maxwell, with Blair getting outside assistance potentially, and then with the more obvious potential for outside assistance with Andy Poole, who seems like a real good-natured, smiling guy and everything, but I got yellow teeth too, just like him. But the problem is the rules are there for a reason. You know what I mean? And maybe another competitor's going to get demoralized if Andy's out there at all the checkpoints, with his wife and that kind of thing. So there has to be a little more respect, I think. And I think that some of these people who are snow machining the trail are very enthusiastic about the sport. They're not necessarily bad people, but they are crossing the line and pushing the boundaries. And I also think that goes for Dijon Rowe, who is a past competitor who last year was photographed embracing Nick Petit in Unically as he came in, and she sort of cursed him, is what I was kind of half joking, half accurately observing, where he came in second, just like she did back in 98, 99, and then next year he scratched. And should she really be taking that photo in that shelter cabin this year? Should she really be putting her hands on a competitor as he comes into a checkpoint? Well, he doesn't even have time to check in. I mean, is she his spouse? What is she doing there? There's some, I think the race officials at those checkpoints need to give those dog teams and those mushers more room, whether it's a Dijon Rowe and Nick Petit, or whether it's Andy Poole kneeling down the straw with his wife. You know what I mean? I think if you're in the race and you're in the competition, just like a football game or something like that, if you're not competing on that field, you need to be on the sidelines. Thanks.